Meditation ended up saving my life because what happened was I was so exhausted, I started going down in the water a little bit, see the surface of the water going like this, farther away from me. Maybe I'm 3, 4 feet down underwater now, holding my breath, and my mind popped out of my body. But I knew what it was. It didn't surprise me. Like a lot of times, people you hear them describe their NDE experience, and their mind leaves their body, or however they describe it, and they go, "Wow, this is amazing." They feel so peaceful and everything. I felt that I saw that happen, and I knew what it was because I'd been meditating for 2 years, and it had happened to me dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the channel within. I'm Mira. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Kelvin Chin, and I am excited to delve into talking about his NDE as well as the books that he has authored. Welcome, Kelvin, and thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks, Mira. Great to be here.
The feeling is mutual. So, Kelvin, do you mind if we start with life before early background to get a context to, how life has unfolded for you?
Sure. So, I was born here in the United States. I was born in Boston. Um, Grew up in a science family. So, not with, obviously, I'm Asian, but not with Asian cultural background. So, a science background. Father was an engineer, mother's a chemistry major, which blows my mind, majoring in chemistry.
Mine
Anyway,
too.
is that right? Oh my God. Oh my God. Anyway, so grew up in suburbia of Boston, went to church, did not pay close attention when I was in Sunday school. Okay. Thought it was a bunch of nice stories. Went to Protestant Christian Sunday school. Nice stories, make people feel good. That's the way I kind of looked at it. I didn't really look at it as anything very, not certainly not literal. That's not the way I looked at it. The Bible, Sunday school, and so forth. Um, my aunts told me this, so I don't have a memory of what I'm going to tell you. But when I was much younger than that, they think I was around 2 years old or something like that, playing in my grandparents, of course, their parents, my grandparents' living room when my aunts were still in high school and junior high school at the time, much younger than my mom. Um, they remember me playing with my invisible friends. So I don't remember this. And then it was very open about it. It was very matter of fact, they said. And they told me this when I was a teenager, when I was approximately in high school or college or something. They told me that they remembered this about me. I don't remember that. I think I pushed it away because they kind of made fun of me. They, like not real explicit, but you know how adults can look down at children when oh, look at his imagination, that kind of thing. Where I was pissed off at them when they told me this because I think it was probably 15-year-old anger I was been carrying around all those years from them making kind of, oh, he's imagining. No, I'm not imagining. I could really see my friends. Anyway, that's something that I don't have memory of that other people told me about. Um, I learned to meditate when I was a teenager. I was very stressed out. I learned to meditate. I learned transcendental meditation at the time, um, mainly because of the early first medical study that was being done at the time I learned to meditate by a Boston cardiologist named Herbert Benson. And I later, about 6, 8 months later, was a test subject in those experiments. They took blood samples, they did all kinds of stuff. They were measuring from the meditation experience. I studied personally with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi a couple of years later, and he's the guy. People don't know his name. He's the guru who taught the Beatles to meditate. in the late 1960s. Um, so I studied personally with him. I was an international leader in his organization for about 10 years. And then I left when they started getting into other things besides meditation. I wanted to stay focused on teaching meditation. And I've changed the teaching. I've removed the cultural associations and trappings from the teaching, and I've made it easier and more flexible. So I call what I teach now turning within meditation. 10 to 15 minutes each time, twice a day. Don't have to do it for very long. I've taught thousands and thousands of people since then. I taught the first meditation courses in the history of the U.S. Army and in a West Point Military Academy and all over the world. Um, about 6 or 7 years into my meditation uh, experiences, my meditation career or journey or whatever you want to call it, I started opening up in having past life memories spontaneously. So now my memories go back 6 to 8,000 years, a couple of dozen different lifetimes, and I've written about it in this book that you have there, um,
Yes.
After the Afterlife. Um, and then my mom died in my third year of law school. So after I was teaching meditation for about 10 years, I went to law school. My mom suddenly died of cancer, but she was asymptomatic. And by the time she had symptoms, they scanned her and they found thousands of tumors throughout her body, just in her brain. But so who knows how many were in the rest of her body. But she died very suddenly. It was a very shocking experience for all of us. I was very close to my mom. Um, and That's what propelled me into helping people with death and dying issues because I needed help myself in dealing with the grief and the processing and wrapping my mind around death and the dying experience that I had just gone through with my mom. So many years later, many decades later, just 10 years ago, I wrote my first book on overcoming the fear of death. That's this book. Um, and They're on paperback, audiobook, and ebook also. So the Overcoming the Fear of Death book is specifically a non-religious, non-cultural approach to death and dying. Because when I was in law school talking to friends, about death and dying, just having conversations after my mom died, and then I'd self-disclose, and then they'd tell me, "Oh, my brother just died in a motorcycle accident in Utah." Some just stuff like that, just that we normally wouldn't have talked about. I realized how helpful it was to talk about this. So I wanted to write a book to try to help people open up and talk more about death and dying, and not just shelve it and put it in a closet somewhere and make believe it doesn't exist. And so I came up with these four beliefs about death and dying that are not religious and not cultural beliefs, to help people think about them, think about uh, death and dying through their specific religious, non-religious, sorry, non-religious and non-cultural belief systems. So we can get into that. But and it so I started getting into helping people with death and dying, and then I started opening up and communicating with the other side completely spontaneously. This was now in the 1980s. It started happening, and I went through an identity crisis. I thought I was making it up. I thought, who am I? What is this? Is this really coming from outside me, or am I making this up? Is it coming from inside me? All of that. I went through that kind of an identity crisis for about a year and a half, 2 years or something like that. This was many years ago. So it was approximately, a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. But now it's very comfortable for me. And so communicating with beings on the other side, dead loved ones, people I know, people I don't know.
So, Kelvin, what convinced you that it is real and not self talk then?
Yeah. What convinced me were several things. A number of things that I didn't know about or wasn't even thinking about, or wasn't really interested in. Um, Information started coming to me about other people, some of whom I didn't even know. And then I would start communicating with people and saying, hey, I don't know if you want to know about this, but I just got some information. And it would get corroborated by third parties like that. And many of whom I didn't even know. So I kind of did medium work. I didn't call it that. I don't like that phrase. I started doing sessions with people for about 6 months. Then I stopped doing it because I want to instead empower people to do it themselves. I don't like creating dependence. And so people who've taken my classes can know that about me. I teach meditation. I want them to be independent meditating. Will I help them and guide them? Of course, forever I'll help them and guide them. But my goal is to make people independent um, uh, self-developers, you could call it, including how they think about death and dying. I'm not here to change people's belief systems to match my belief systems. It's about their belief system. And so when I started helping people, I realized they were using me as a crutch when I was starting to do those sessions, these psychic sessions, whatever I called them then, spiritual sessions and so forth. I do spiritual coaching now, but I don't do it for that reason. I may help people open up, but I'm helping them open up. I'm not doing readings for them like I used to do in the 1980s. Um,
So did you have to turn hearing things
oh,
about?
oh,
No,
oh.
okay.
In fact, I get stuff from the other side, and I get stuff from, what in we talked about, your culture and so forth. They call the Akashic records, but I just call it the superhighway of information, just because I like to make things non-cultural and so forth. But I get information like that, so forth. But I don't always tell people that I'm getting it. I know where it's coming from. And sometimes I'm getting it from specific individuals on the other side too. But I don't always say that because it's just distracting to the conversation that I may be having with somebody. So it just kind of flows. That's what I mean when the veil between this side and the other side for me is pretty transparent. I get information, and I can tell where it's coming from, you know, but I don't necessarily have to explain that to people, especially if they're not into that. I want to freak them out. Um, yeah, and then I had an NDE also. So we can talk about that if you want to. When I was 20 years old or something like that, I almost drowned.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk about the NDE?
Yeah, we can talk about the NDE because um, I had been meditating for 2 years before the NDE, and that's important to the story
It's
because,
awesome that you got into meditating so young and then
yeah,
was um, part of the test case in
yeah,
Boston, and
yeah,
then was the first teacher in the army as well.
yeah. And I was in my early 20s at the time, right?
Wow.
I was a teenager in the experiments, and I was teaching in the U.S. Army. I had a GS-11 rating, I think. It was the equivalent of like a major in the Army, the rank of major.
But has that position gone away? Because, you don't see an opening for it unless whoever gets in never leaves.
Oh, you mean in the Army?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I don't know. I don't think they're teaching it anymore in the Army like I was. Um, I know that at West Point because I worked as a lawyer at a law firm. When I was at a law firm 10, 15 years ago, I talked with a young lawyer in my law firm who I had seen on his bio that he went to West Point. And I said, and he said, "Oh, did you go to West Point?" I said, "No, but I taught there." And I told him that I taught meditation, the first meditation courses in the history of West Point Military Academy. And he said, "Oh, maybe you're the reason why they have this. They have a center there, and they do all kinds of different self-development techniques there. And maybe they teach a form of meditation, but not what I was teaching. Anyway, so that has happened. I'm a seed planter, I guess, right? I'm planting seeds, and then they germinate in different ways in different places. I mean, I went to Dartmouth College as an undergraduate, and I started the first meditation club at Dartmouth,
Wow.
and of any kind of meditation. And I started the meditation club, and I went to the dean's office one day and asked the dean's assistant, um, if there was a place where I could start the meditation club, like a physical place in one of the Dartmouth buildings. And she said, "Oh yeah." She grabbed her bunch of keys and she went over to Robinson Hall, went up to the third floor or something, and she opened up this door, and it was just the whole attic of this big Ivy League brick building, the whole attic. It was just stored with junk, like broke, chairs and extra desks and this and that. And she said, just find a place in here and you can use it. So I went out and bought like a secondhand rug and a desk, a floor lamp or something. And that was our meditation club. I went there as an alumni council member about 5 or 6 years ago, right before COVID. And one of the students told me that that's the wellness center for Dartmouth now, for the whole campus.
Very cool. You're a pioneer.
I know. I was like, wow. Except it's not an attic anymore. It's all these cubicles and offices and, nice furniture and carpeting and everything. Anyway, so yeah, my NDE. So what happened was I'd been meditating, as I said, for a couple of years. And then I went to UCSD in La Jolla, San Diego, University of California, San Diego, in La Jolla, California, for a summer school program, an intensive 8 or 10 week program in Mandarin Chinese. Because I'm Chinese and I didn't know how to speak Chinese. So I started studying Chinese when I was at Dartmouth, and I took a year's worth in a summer at UCSD. Uh, so at registration, I met this girl um, who also was from Massachusetts and also was going to school in Massachusetts. And that's important to the story also because neither of us had ever been in the Pacific Ocean before. Neither of us had ever been to California before. So I said, hey, I met her at registration. So I said, hey, class doesn't start for, a day or two or whatever. Let's go to the beach. So I met her back there at registration desk. We walked down to those people who know the campus, you can literally walk down to the beach from UCSD. You're at what's called Black's Beach, which is part of Torrey Pines State Park. And some people may recognize Torrey Pines because of the PGA Tour, the Professional Golf Association Tour. So there's on the plateau is a golf course, PGA golf course, Torrey Pines golf course, and then 300 feet down below that is the beach. And so it's got this beautiful view of the ocean and everything. So we're down on the beach. There's no lifeguards. There's never any lifeguards there. It's just a state park, and you can go swimming there and doing whatever. We were the only ones there. It was a beautiful June afternoon. It was a hot day. So what's the first thing you do when a hot day? You walk into the beach, you get to the water, and you walk in, you wade in, and I don't know, maybe I was waist deep in the water, and I dunked, and she was about 15 feet away from me or something, maybe 20 feet away from me in the water. And I see the 300-foot high cliffs starting going like this, and they're getting smaller and smaller. And I'm getting pulled out in what's called a rip current, which is basically a river in the ocean. And you can't see them when you're when you're at sea level with them. You could see them if you were a few hundred feet up. You can look down and you can see the current moving in the ocean. But I didn't know, and I didn't know what it was, and I didn't never heard of it until then. I guess they're all around the world, rip currents. But I get pulled out, and in a matter of seconds, maybe, I don't know, I was freaking out. I was panicking. So I don't know. I wasn't keeping track of time, but it didn't take very long for me to be almost 2 miles out. I asked a friend of mine if the cliffs were 3 or 4 inches tall. He's a sailor and a sea captain, captain of big ocean going vessels. So I said, 3 or 4 inches tall, 300-foot high cliffs. How far out was I? So you were out 1.7 miles. I was 1.7 miles offshore, no boats, nobody, no people. She was the only one on that beach that we saw, and there were no boats anywhere. And I started swimming in, and that's the wrong thing to do. So you're supposed to swim at an angle to try to
Parallel.
current,
Yeah.
parallel to the shore for a
Right to the
while.
shore.
Yeah, and then you go. I just panicked. I forgot all my Boy Scout training, and I'm going in, and I'm exhausted, exhausted, exhausted. I'm freaking out, which is, of course, making me more exhausted because my fight or flight is turning on, right? Eh. So even though I'd been meditating for 2 years, I thought this was it, How am I going to get back in? But meditation ended up saving my life because what happened was I was so exhausted, I started going down in the water a little bit, see the surface of the water going like this, farther away from me. Maybe I'm 3, 4 feet down underwater now, holding my breath. And my mind popped out of my body. But I knew what it was. It didn't surprise me. Like a lot of times people, you hear them describe their NDE experience and their mind leaves their body or however they describe it. And they go, wow, this is amazing. They feel so peaceful and everything. I felt that, I saw that happen, and I knew what it was because I'd been meditating for 2 years, and it had happened to me dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times. I don't know. Over the 2 years I'd been meditating, I'd had a similar experience. So it wasn't unfamiliar to me. So I knew what it was. I knew, and I went, uh-oh. And I willed myself back into my body. When I say will, I just had the desire. It wasn't like, oh, I got to get back in. It was just, I had a desire, like, oh, and I went back in. That's an example of how subtle choice is in life. A lot of times people think of choice and free will and making choices in life as like, oh, I got to choose to do this. Well, that is a choice, but desire is a subtle form of choice. And it just my mind went back into my body. I struggled the 4 or 5 feet back up to the surface because I was so exhausted already, obviously. And I just flipped over my back, got my breath, and then I had some thought like this was so many years ago. I was 20 years old. So I had some thought like just don't rush or don't panic or something like that. So I just took my time swimming in. Whereas before I was struggling to try to get in like, fast and I was going against the current. I must have left the grip current just a little bit when I was floating down in the water because when I started swimming back in, I was make I was getting towards the cliffs. I was moving towards the shore, and she said it took me an hour to get back in. She estimates she didn't want to leave me there. She wanted to keep her eye on me, and then I crawled up on the shore and I passed out. She said I passed out for about 20 minutes. I was exhausted.
You said in the meditation, I think that you
Yeah,
did have
right.
similar type experiences to an ND. Well, was it where you are having OBEs then, out of
Yes.
body type
Yeah.
experiences?
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't know all this terminology back then. I just knew it. I just called it experience. But now I know it's OBE, it means out of body experience. Yeah, I was having out of body experiences during my meditation sometimes, not every time, but enough times so that I knew what it was when my body was going down in the water and my mind did that. It didn't surprise me. That's why I say I think meditation saved my life in retrospect. Looking back, I think it saved my life because if I had what people call a classical NDE, I'd have been like, whoa, this is cool. Wow, I feel so peaceful, blah, blah, blah. And my body would just keep sinking down. I probably would have been 50, 60 feet sitting on the bottom of the ocean in this state of bliss and dead, because I couldn't hold my breath anymore. Yeah,
Yeah, I agree.
that's my experience in between lifetimes as well, is we can choose when we want to come back also.
So you had that experience as well,
Yeah,
and in between. Can we talk about that? That is fascinating.
sure. Yeah, I have several memories of that. Once from a couple thousand years ago, and once um, it happened in before the lifetime previous to this one. When I came back in the second, I came back in around 1918. Okay, and it was actually when I was writing this book. I was in the middle of writing this book, and I was swimming laps in my city swimming pool. I swim laps twice a week. And so, I swim regularly, for years I swim laps. And so you get used to it. It's kind of a meditative state. You kind of not really thinking, oh, I got to do this. Da, da, da. You're just kind of relaxed. And I don't have to think about technique and so forth. I'm just doing it. And what happened was, so this was February, I think it was February, but it was 2023 when I was writing that book a couple of years ago now, almost 3 years ago. Um, and I had this really unusual experience while I was swimming. So this is in my 21st century lifetime in 2023, right? I'm having this unusual experience. This is an example of how these past life memories have popped up and awarenesses have popped up in my consciousness. But this one was like we're saying it was an in-between lifetime. And I had this memory of looking down at planet Earth, watching World War One. Okay. I was watching World War One, like I'm in the afterlife or heaven, whatever you call it, and I'm aware of what's going on Earth in Europe, and as World War One is going on, and I'm trying to remember the memory now. So the memory that I had in the swimming pool was that I remembered World War One was going on, and something was going to happen that made another world. I didn't know if it was going to be a world war or what, World War II. I didn't have a premonition about how big it was going to be, but I knew that there was going to be something that happened between Russia and Germany based on what I was observing in World War One. Now, where did that come from? I don't know. At this point in the swimming pool, I didn't know. So I knew that there was something going on, and that's why I came back. That's why I came back in to get reborn before this Kelvin Chin lifetime. I don't know what my name was, and I don't know exactly who I was, but I was a World War II fighter pilot in the US Navy flying off aircraft carriers in the South Pacific. Okay. So I had separately had memories of that. So I knew that I had a lifetime. So I'd had that memory for decades. But this one that I'm telling you, the in between lifetime experience was like 2023, a memory of it happening in 1918. So when I got out of the swimming pool and I go home, this is a teaching example for people who are listening to this who are curious of what they can do. This is what I tell my students: follow the breadcrumbs. Follow the breadcrumbs. So you have breadcrumbs, so follow them, see where they take you. I didn't know where this was going to take me. So then I follow the breadcrumbs and I go back and I go, when did Second World War end? I knew it was somewhere around 1918, 19, something like that. I knew it was the late teens there. I wasn't exactly sure which month and year and all this and stuff. And what I found was that I'd never, Kelvin Chin didn't know this history point until I looked it up on the internet, that Russia surrendered to Germany in the fall of whatever year it was. Let's say, I think the World War II ended in June of, I think, 1918. So let's just make believe it's 19. I can't remember if it's 1918 or 1919, whatever. I think it's 1918. But the 6 months earlier, Russia surrendered to Germany and lost a huge amount of they lost a huge amount of troops. They had to give up a huge amount of money and supplies and all kinds of stuff to Germany it was incredibly embarrassing for Russia. Okay. Now, nobody knew that Germany was going to eventually lose World War I. Okay. But Russia had surrendered about 6 months before Germany surrendered. Okay. But Russia surrendered to Germany. All right. So when I found that out, I went, whoa, that now makes sense to me. Because in my 18th century lifetime, I was leading fights and strategy and so forth against Russia. When I was a European leader in Prussia, I was fighting the Russians, and I knew the emotional, the cultural, the the embarrassment, all of that political and emotional, cultural baggage that would accompany the fact that Russia surrendered to Germany. They were not going to let Germany live with that, literally, for very long. So they get into the Second World War, and the history about Russia and Germany in the Second World War. It was horrific. Between the two, how many, that's where most of the millions of people who died in World War II. Those are the battles where most of them died. Most Americans don't even realize that, but that's anyway, tens of millions just in those battles alone between Russia and Germany. Well, where did that come from? So that came from my knowledge from hundreds of years before in the 1700s, past life memory, and then I connected the dots, and I guessed, and I was right about, and then I came back in as an American, and I ended up in the Second World War. Yeah,
Very cool.
yeah.
Which past life memory was the most memorable?
There's several, but you know, out of the, let's just say, get this out of the way. Out of the 2 dozen past lives that I have memories of, and I probably have had thousands and thousands of past lives, but I have memories of 2 dozen of them. Um, a few of them are famous people. So not all of them are famous people. Just a few of them are. Okay? So let's get that out of the way. It's not about famous people, and whether I was that famous person or not, quite frankly, doesn't matter to me either if my memories are absolutely right or wrong. But there's enough corroboration from um, third parties who I don't know and didn't know, that I talk about in the book, that seem to indicate that those memories are accurate. But whether they are or not is not important. What's important is what we take away from these memories, and how can they help us live life today in our present day life. In this case, Kelvin Chin, 21st century, 20th and 21st century Earth. So the one that really helped me the most, I would say, was my slave lifetime. And that's why it's the one I talk about in here. It's the first public mention of any of my lifetimes, is the Carthaginian slave one from around 2300 or something, 2300 years ago, that I remember, because it helped me the most today. And I don't remember what slave I was and whatever, but I was a slave on a Carthaginian warship. I was African. I had very dark black skin, like blue black, really, really dark black skin. So I knew I was African. I had this vision. I saw this. It was one of my very earliest past life memories that happened when in my 20s. And when I was in my 20s, this lifetime. And I was dying, or almost dying, on a piece of wreckage on a big body of water. I didn't know initially it was the Mediterranean. Later, I figured that out. First, I thought it was just in the ocean because I couldn't see land or anything. But then I started seeing ships and the type of ships, and we were rowing, and I was a slave. I was a rower on a Carthaginian warship. And those people who don't know ancient history, Carthage ruled the Mediterranean long before the Roman Empire did. The Carthage Empire was the powerful empire for many, many, many years, many hundreds of years before the Roman Empire. Everybody knows about the Roman Empire. Very few people, know history enough to go back and you should study the Carthaginian Empire. Anyway, um, I was rowing on one of those ships fighting the Romans, and several connect the dots things I talk about in the book that I didn't know about helped me figure out that when it was, in what time period, and so forth, that were certain things that were unique to certain ships at that time. But back to your question, the important thing that I took away from that experience was that my mind was very strong and I willed my body to stay alive. It's kind of parallel to the NDE almost drowning experience I had, where in fact both of them happened in bodies of water. Both of them happened, both in situations I thought I was going to die. And I willed myself to stay alive on this piece of wreckage 2,300 years ago until some fisherman or somebody came and found me and rescued me. But the power of my mind is what I took away from that experience. The power of my mind over my body. Now, can I grow another limb? No, I don't think so. But can I will myself with my mind over my physical reality to push through? Yes, I could do that to a certain extent, right? There's limits to all this, but so I've used it in my 20th century and 21st century lifetime. I use that knowledge about the power of my mind to help push me through very difficult times in my lifetime as Kelvin Chin. Like I've been laid off 5 times since I was 50 years old. And yet I found another job and I would pull myself together mentally and just kind of shore myself up, strengthen myself from within with my mind so that I could go into the interview and act like I was confident, even though I was freaked out that I would not going to get the job and to support my family of four as the only breadwinner. So it's survival in that respect financially for my family. So kind of in survival mode again, but using my mind to strengthen myself from within. That's why I call the meditation that I teach turning within. That's where our strength needs to come from. And that experience 2,300 years ago taught me that.
That's beautiful. Um, in terms of your upbringing in this lifetime, since you were Christian, how hard was it for you to work through, past lives when you realized that you were having past life memories?
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I was a light, Christian light. I wasn't really all in. Um, but I guess it was at first very confusing for me
Yeah,
because
I imagine that's not something that you bought in right away.
no, because I was the opposite actually. I was, what do I mean by that? So I learned to meditate. I was into meditation for stress reasons, stress reduction reasons, high anxiety. I was very high anxiety. I was not into it for spiritual reasons. Now, people who are listening to this may say, well, wait a minute. You had these out of body experiences and that. Yeah, but I didn't look at it as a spiritual experience. I didn't know what out of body meant. I never heard the phrase before until 10 years ago. I didn't know what an OBE was until 5 years ago. You know, so I was not into meditation for spiritual reasons. Yes, I was probably having lots of spiritual experiences, but didn't label them that way. I was in the education arm of the meditation organization at the time, the business arm, teaching at businesses, teaching in schools, teaching in the army. You don't walk into the army and say, hey, let's talk about past lives. You know, you're worried about that lifetime and not getting killed in this lifetime. And the leadership doesn't want you talking to them about past lives. oh, or even heaven, I mean, I'm sure the priests and the ministers talk about heaven with the soldiers, but that's not why they brought me in. They brought me in to reduce the drug and alcohol rehab or drug and alcohol issues as part of the drug and alcohol rehab program and reduce stress and anxiety. Okay, that's where I was coming from meditation wise. And I didn't believe in reincarnation. We used to walk around, my friends who were also teaching meditation in the sports, taught one of my buddies who's on my nonprofit board now, taught meditation to professional athletes and college athletes. All the UNC Chapel Hill basketball team learned, the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball team whole learned, everybody learned, it's over, so on. So we were in that arm of the organization teaching meditation. We used to walk around at conferences, meditation, we could call it a conference, meditation conference, with our other fellow, more spiritually oriented meditation teachers. We'd just laugh at them. We would just, laugh. It's kind of laugh behind your back. We didn't get in their face about this, but we thought, like, yeah, reincarnation. These people are like, they're just so like their imagination's just running wild. That's where I came from. That's where my belief system, my mindset was. And then I started having these memories that just could not be explained otherwise. The first memory I had wasn't even a memory. I didn't even know was a memory. I had a bad dream. I had a really, really bad dream. That's the first thing I talk about in that in my past life book, right? The bad dream, it just was a nightmare, but it was like nightmare times 100 for me emotionally. I was really upset. I woke up in a sweat and this is in my 20th century lifetime. I woke up in a sweat and just in a, just really upset and so forth. And I just chalked it up as a nightmare because I had nightmares before, but this one was really a bad one, upsetting one emotionally. Maybe 6 or 8 months later, I'm on a meditation retreat with a bunch of, you know, people who some I knew, some I didn't. And we were doing some energy movement exercises during a group meditation, moving our internal energy, right? During the group meditation. And people were like getting energy twitches and they were wiggling around, and some guys were cross-legged. I never sit cross-legged when I meditate anyway, but some people they're sitting cross-legged. Some could sit in a full lotus or a half lotus, and they're like hopping around like frogs, and they look like frogs hopping around. They get energy rushes, supposedly. Okay. So what happened to me is I flipped over on my back. We were sitting on the floor on pieces of foam, 4-inch foam mattresses covered with sheets, twin sheets, just wall to wall, the whole room. Maybe 75 of us in there in the hotel that I was in over in Switzerland. And I flipped over on my back and I started being crucified, like upside down. I was on my back. My feet are up in the air. And it just completely spontaneously, energetically happened. It was completely involuntary. And I was reliving being crucified emotionally, physically, mentally. I could feel the whole thing. So then, after lunch one day, we all would go for walks. And went for a walk with my buddy George. And I started telling him about the dream that I'd had maybe 6 or 8 months earlier. And I just told him the beginning of it. I got this dream. I had this really intense dream, George, like, 6 months ago or something. I was really upset. And he finished the dream for me. He told me where I was. He told me what I was wearing. He told me, you know, that my face was tear streaked and all this because I've been crying all night and this and that. And I said, "How did you know that? You're not a psychic. Where did you get this from?" You know, he was a lawyer anyway. So, um, but we meditated and we taught meditation together, and we were on this meditation retreat. And he said, "Because I'm the one who found you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, I found you 2,000 years ago. I found you in that ditch on the side of the road. And he said, you don't know who you are. You've been for 2 weeks in the group meditation. You said you've been flipping over on your back every time, and then you get crucified. I mean, I can see you being flipped over, but you say internally you've been feeling this intense experience. And and he opened the door up, and because he knew who I was for a couple of years, evidently before that, because he recognized who I was because his memories had started opening up a couple of years before mine did. But he didn't want to tell me. He wanted to see if mine would open up by themselves. And then, yeah, so we had all kinds of conversations since then, obviously. And uh, yeah, that's how the first one opened up. But I didn't even know what it was. And then a whole cascade, it just started cascading, many different ones opening up. I had 3 or 4 different past lifetimes opening up at different rates and different amounts at the same time during that time period in my mid 20s.
That's a really young time, that's when you're really young for that to be happening to you.
I know.
So I can imagine that the download and the processing of that had to be challenging.
Yeah, but the but is I never thought I'd be talking about it. And I didn't talk about it. The only person I told was him. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell my girlfriends. I didn't tell did I tell my first wife? Yeah, I told my first wife because I'm getting married. I got to tell her like about the crazy person she's about to marry. Anyways, so I told my wife, but I didn't broadcast it to people. I didn't think I was going to be publicly talking about it. And I wasn't, this is the first public mention of any past life, and it's the Carthaginian one, right? The slave one. These other ones where I may have been a known person, I didn't start talking about that till 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, publicly. Because when George and I first started talking about this in our mid 20s, we thought, what's the point? We don't need to talk about this with people. People think we're nuts anyway. So uh, little did I know that after my mom died, I started helping people with death and dying issues, and then whatever. And then many decades later, I would write the books and so forth. And I help people now with past life stuff, especially traumatic experiences that they've had that they're wrestling with and trying to move forward from, you know.
So is
And
that something you still do with the traumatic past
yeah,
life?
yes. So I do that as part of my call it holistic life coaching. So holistic and spiritual life coaching is what I sometimes refer to it as. I do that now with people individually. Um, and yeah, I teach classes. In fact, I have a class coming up in June, another one. I'm doing it about once a year. I was at the, you know, several years ago at peak, I was doing it 3, 4 times a year, that class. But now I'm just doing it once a year. So I'm going to do once in June. It's a 6-week program on afterlife uh, issues, concepts, experiences, afterlife and reincarnation experiences. And I go through all different concepts about the afterlife, a lot of which is highly misunderstood by people, including spiritual teachers who are teaching it out there. They'll say one thing here and they'll say another thing here, and they don't go together. There's a lot of that's what's called cognitive dissonance, if people know that psychological term. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, thinking that doesn't go together. That's what cognitive dissonance means. And there's a lot of that. And so it creates a lot of myths. And the reason I want to, clear up those confusing points is because it creates suffering. That confusion creates suffering. The dissonant thinking, the thinking that somehow we merge when we die with God or the absolute, or, that's the Vedic translation, the absolute, or merge with some cosmic energy or whatever, makes no logical sense especially when a medium is talking about it. Who are they talking to? Cosmic soup? No, they're talking to an individual mind that still exists on the other side. And merging does not mean connecting. Merging means losing individuality. That's what oneness means. There's no such thing as oneness. There is connection. Connection is not the same as merging and oneness. Oneness means you lose your individuality. So it makes no sense when you hear mediums talking about oneness and merging after you die. Who are they talking to? So individuality still exists on the other side. That's who we're communicating with is individual minds, energies. Um, I'll plant another seed here. I'm starting to talk about this one more assertively and publicly. I've danced with it over the years, but I want to make this point very, very clear. This is a classic misunderstanding amongst many, many people in the spiritual communities worldwide. They talk about the body and the mind as being physical and non-physical. I think that's fundamentally incorrect and leads to a huge amount of conflation and confusion and all kinds of theories to try to support this physical and non-physical perception or perspective that I think is fundamentally incorrect. Yes, the mind is not a biological thing. So I used to say physical and non-physical years ago. For years ago, recently, like as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, I said physical and non-physical. Maybe even more recently than that, 3 years ago. But about 3 or 4 years ago, I started calling the distinction biological and non-biological. Okay. So, yes, we are in a biological body here on planet Earth. When we die, we are no longer in a biological body. Do we still have a body? Yes. You hear people talk about an energy body. Well, an energy body is a body. It's not a biological body. Is it non physical? So then they'll say, but the energy body is non physical. And I say, I understand why you're saying that. Here's why I think it's fundamentally incorrect. Talk to a physicist. Ask the physicist, because a lot of spiritual people are quoting physicists in this quantum mechanics theory, which is a probability theory. It's not meant to describe reality, physical reality. Okay. So that's the fundamental thing that a lot of people, including the doctors who are not quantum mechanics physicists, don't understand. Okay. But so they use it to try to justify this non-physical, physical um, perspective. Instead, I say the mind is material. It's made of material, and energy is material. If you talk to a physicist and you ask them, is energy material? They say, yeah, it's specific, it's identifiable, and it can be measured. You can measure energy. And if that's the case, it's not cosmic soup. It's not this oneness thing. It's specific. Now, it's not biological. So, yes, that's the distinction that I think we need to start making. And if we make that one distinction and we come up with that one agreed understanding that energy is material, a lot of these theories that a lot of spiritual groups come up with and teachers and so forth come up with are completely unnecessary. I think each of us has an identifiable energy pattern. And those of you who know anything about airplanes and jets and so forth and helicopters, they have a transponder and it's sending out an energy signal that has their specific code that codes that particular flying vehicle on radar. And I think we all have radar, it's energy, that called our mind. Our mind is a form of radar, and we can pick up those identifiable energy patterns. And then on the other side, like you said, we can get together with our friends, say, hey, let's go back in together as a group. Let's meet up in kindergarten, or let's whatever it is. and let's get together and do this little group thing or whatever when we go down there and you go to this family, you go to that family. We can do that because we have identified each other on the other side, and we can continue to identify each other here, even though we don't have the same last name, we don't have the same genetics, our DNA is different, we don't have the genealogy is completely different, and yet we are the same soul family in a sense because of this identifiable energy pattern that we recognize in each other.
I would love to talk about the four beliefs for
Hmm.
overcoming the fear of death. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I came up with these four beliefs because I start to hear people talking about this. I wanted, first of all, I wanted people to talk more about death and dying. And what I would start to see is in our conversations about death and dying back then, this is when I was in law school, when there were a big enough group of people, uh, you'd hear all these different views about death and dying, and very often people would default to their religious or their cultural views about death and dying, which is understandable. I'm not criticizing that, but that's very much the default for most people. But then what happened was sometimes, not all the time, but I would start to see a pattern where people start to convince the other people in the group that their cultural belief, that their religious belief about death and dying was the right one. And I thought, yeah, this is just going to shut people down and not. And my objective was, let's talk about this more. So that's why I came up with these non religious, non cultural beliefs. And the four beliefs are this. The first belief is the science belief. And these are four beliefs underlie and support, you could say, worldwide, any of the religious and cultural beliefs that are out there. So the science belief is out there. We know that one. That's the one where people believe there's no afterlife, there's no heaven, there's nothing that happens after you biologically die. That's it. One life. That's it. That's all you got. Okay. That was my father's belief. Okay. Remind me, Mira, to come back and tell you a story about my father that's not in the book. Okay. All right.
Okay.
My father had that belief. A lot of people have that one. The first belief, science belief. Okay. Second belief system I call the fear of continued existence. That's where people believe in some form of afterlife. You continue after you biologically die, the mind continues, but there's fear. And the fear could be due to any number of things. So I help people think this through in my coaching sessions if they need that kind of help and so forth. Um, what's the fear really? Is it really the fear of death, or is it a related fear? Is it the fear of losing loved ones? That's not the fear of your death. It's the consequence of your death, but that's a different fear. Fear of pain and suffering. That's not of overcoming the fear of your death. It's a fear of how you're going to die. So I help people think about these. Where is it in this spectrum of fears about death and dying? And then we can identify a solution and so forth and move forward. The second belief system, again, fear of continued existence. Okay. Third belief system is no fear, believe in an afterlife, but no fear, may even be looking forward to it, going to heaven or whatever. Okay. Fourth belief system, reincarnation, past lives, future lives, can come back if you want to into another physical form, so forth. Same soul, but different physical body. Okay. Different biological body. See, even there, I caught myself saying physical body instead of biological body. I'm still getting used to that distinction myself. So those are the four belief systems. So everybody falls in somewhere in that spectrum. Now you may be a fence sitter. You may be like a little bit of this one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's this one or maybe both. Maybe this and that one. That's okay too. So on my website, I have four websites. The Overcoming the Fear of Death website, there's a questionnaire people there's like, I can't remember, 30 something questions. Um, it's multiple choice, which will help you figure out which belief system that you're in of the four. So there's a lot of people who have come and asked me if they could use that in their classes at school, like therapists and, you know, therapy professors and so forth. And or different undergraduate and graduate school professors have asked me and teachers have asked me if they can use it. Or I've had a few PhD candidates ask me if they could use that in their thesis, the questionnaire, and I said, yeah, that's fine. Just mention my website somewhere on it, and just in your thesis, and that's good enough. That's where you got it from. So that's there. Anyway, for belief systems, yeah. So I look through my client's belief system, not mine. I look through their lens, their belief system, to help them reduce and overcome their fears.
What is one misconception people have about accepting death that you would like to help address, that you would like to address?
Accepting death.
Yes.
Oh, well, there's several, but let's say one of which, I think one big one about accepting death itself is we think it's going to end. And so what I tell people is that if you really have the first belief system like my dad did, he had no fear about death because first of all, what's fear? Fear is the emotion caused by the anticipation of unhappiness. My dad had no anticipation of unhappiness or happiness for that matter after he biologically died because his belief system was firm. He would say, stick me in a box, throw the dirt on me, I'm done. That was the famous quote from my dad with a cigar hanging out of his mouth. Stick me in a box, throw the dirt on me, I'm done. That's it when I die. That's what he would say. So he had no fear. So really, if the person really has the first belief system, they should have no fear about death. If they do, and they tell me that they have the first belief system, I point out to them, well, you don't really completely believe in the first belief system. You have remnants of the second one there because you're not sure. And so I call that the fear of uncertainty. So the fear of uncertainty is a variation of the second belief system because they may not believe fully in an afterlife, but they may want to keep the door open just in case. They're wrong. That's still the second, that's like a first, second belief system, and it still has fear. So I help them through that. But that's and then that point um I think is a key point. And then if somebody does believe in an afterlife, the main point that I would leave them with is choice. You have choice in the afterlife. You can choose to help yourself grow, continue to grow and get over your fear. Now, I help people in this life, I mean, on planet Earth, help themselves get past the fear before they die, right? But let's say you die and you still have a fear of death, you can still work on that on the other side, reducing your fear. People are still growing. People think that, oh, it's static on the other side, nothing changes. No, that's that whole oneness merging concept that's wrong. No, it's just there's still individuality and there's still choice, therefore. And you can choose to grow. And I don't often tell my meditation classes this, but in my meditation classes that I teach privately and then sometimes I teach groups. In some of my group classes, sometimes during the group meditation, I can see into the other side and I see beings on the other side taking my meditation class. They're in heaven taking my meditation class with me and my earth human students now. Okay. So there's that. And then there's the other choice issue in terms of reincarnation. Nobody makes you come back. You come back because you chose to come back. Now, you may not remember that you chose to come back. And may not remember why you chose to come back. And you may not remember that your choosing to come back was based on something really superficial and maybe should have had more thought put into it, but you did choose to come back. Okay. Nobody forces you. There's no line that you have to get in. Now, some people, and I've had some people who have memories of being on the other side, some of my clients have told me that they remember being on the other side and just getting in line. That's a choice. They didn't realize that they didn't ask where that line was going, you know? And so be conscious about your choices is what I advise my clients. Be conscious and be strategic. Don't just go into any old family like most people do when they are born. It's a small percentage of the 8 billion humans on planet Earth, I think, who were strategic and thoughtful about which family they went into. You know, a lot of people are just willy-nilly because aren't isn't that how they are when they go to live their life? They're just non-strategic. Most people are opportunistic, not strategic. That's the opposite of strategic, is not planning things out. They're just opportunistic. Oh, well, this happened, so I went with it. Oh, this happened, well, I went with it. And I have corroborations from some of my clients who told me experiences like that where they just got in a line. And one guy told me he went in a line and realized, no, no, I don't want to go in that line. That's going to China. And so he went in a different line, and he was born in, I can't remember, Malaysia, I think, so he could come to the United States easily and go to school. This was decades ago. So anyway, choice is a big message. Yeah.
That's sound advice. We talked prior to recording that in contemplating death, it actually allows us to live more fully. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think living more fully is the goal of everything that I do. Living life more fully in what I call the continual present. I call it the continual present because it's always changing, right? The present, 2 seconds ago is now the past, So we're always living in our continual present. And I think coming to terms in our own individual way, and like I told you, I don't push my belief systems on my clients. I help them think it through themselves, through their lens, whatever their belief system lens is. So, whatever that is, coming to terms with it and feeling comfortable with the death of ourselves, I think removes the energy that looming fear has over us. It just removes it. And then when you relieve yourself of all of that energy associated with the fears around death and dying, you can take a deep breath and then you can actually live your life in the continual present moment much more fully. That's the thing, you know. Reminder to talk. I'll talk to you about this. My father, in the story about my dad. It's not in my book. So one of my clients who I helped overcome the fear of death was helped by my father from the other side in the following way. Remember what my father's belief system was? No afterlife. Okay. So I get uh I connected. This guy found me in Ohio. His name's Joseph. He found me in Ohio on the website, whatever. I live in Los Angeles, California, and we connect on through my website, and I helped him through his fear of death, and he has a dream several weeks later. And he texted me and he said, I think your father came to me in my dream last night. And I'm like, what? So I called him up immediately. I said, Joseph, what are you talking about? Fortunately, he answered the phone. And he said, and the guy, Joseph's like in his 50s. So he said, my whole life, I've had really vivid dreams and I wake up in the morning and I can remember everything. And so he said, last night, Joseph, was flying a World War II bomber over the ocean. And a young Asian officer came up from the rear of the plane to the cockpit, and they were talking about hydraulic fluids in the engine. Now, this guy, Joseph, did not know that my father's specialty as a mechanical engineer was hydraulic fluids. That's what he studied at Northeastern University. Okay, my dad before and right after my dad graduated, the first thing he did after he graduated in 1942, he walked down and he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So, um, and okay, and then he said, at this point, I don't know that this is my. He doesn't know that this is my father. And so we're talking about hydraulic fluids, he said, in the cockpit and everything, the engines, you got four huge engines. Hydraulic fluid is very important. Everything's fine. And he said the young Asian officer then looked at Joseph in his dream and he said, "You're afraid of death, aren't you?" And Joseph said, "How do you know that? I've only told six people in my whole life, and I just told the sixth person about 3 weeks ago." And the young Asian officer smiled at him and said, "Oh, you mean my son, Kelvin? That's my son."
Nice.
So, and then I sent him a picture. I texted him afterwards, a picture of my dad in 1942 in his new Army uniform. My dad and some of his Army buddies, his new recruits, Army buddies, went to a professional photography studio and each had their pictures taken in their new Army uniforms. My dad's sitting there, and he's got a cigarette in his hand as a prop. Anyway, I sent that picture to him, and he said, "That's the guy from my dream." And that's the uniform he was wearing. That's his face. That's him. That was my dad my dad was 21 years old. Yeah.
Look at that. So, evidently his perception changed on the other side.
Yeah, and that's also why I don't push the afterlife on anybody. If somebody really believes that first belief system, like my dad, I never pushed my dad. I said, "Dad, that's fine." Because in my mind, without saying it out loud, I think, yeah, you'll see when you die. And sometimes I do say that to people who are not sure. I said, one of two things going to happen when you biologically die. Either your mind is going to continue or it's not going to continue. That's binary. There's very few things that are black and white, black or white in life, but that's one of them. You biologically die, your mind's going to continue or it's not going to continue. If it doesn't continue, don't all this discussion about fear about death, that is irrelevant. But if it does continue, I'm preparing you to be without fear at that point.
Calvin, if death itself could speak, not as an ending, but as a teacher, would it tell us?
Death would say, "I'm an illusion. I don't really exist."
I love that. That is so true. I have three questions that I would like to ask you. What brings you joy and laughter these days?
Joy and laughter. Joy is helping people, which is what I love to do, regardless of whatever I've chosen to do, even when I was in law firms, helping clients and the lawyers and so forth. But now I'm doing what I really love to do. And laughter, what gives me laughter is observing uh, observing the silly behavior and choices that sometimes people make that they really seriously think are serious choices. So I tell my students not to watch the news too much because it can be very distressing, but a lot of that brings me laughter and at the same time brings me sadness. So both.
Okay. What would you tell a young Calvin who's about to embark on these grand adventures of life?
I would tell the young Kelvin that just to be patient. Um, when you read this book, you'll see it's the last half of this book is about personality traits, and one of my personality traits is impatience. And so to be patient,
What final message or blessings do you have for those listening?
oh, I would say that um, we've talked a lot about past lives today, and even if you don't have any memories, and you maybe never will have any memories of past lives, it doesn't matter. that full self-development can come from reflecting on your emotional patterns, because the emotional patterns, my experience is that our emotional patterns are directly connected to our past, whether it's in this lifetime or another lifetime. We develop these habits and these emotional patterns. And that if we look at our emotional patterns, we can unbundle stuff and that's restricting us and limiting us, and that can further our self-development. And we can also pay attention to, in this current lifetime, things that we are choosing, habits that we are making, and understand that those are habits that we will continue in future lifetimes, whether we're on the other side or in a future lifetime, on planet Earth or in physical biological form or not. We continue those habits. So pay attention to habits you're embracing and developing in this lifetime, because they will become subconscious motivators and drivers of you in your future. And you want to make good choices now so that you have good habits later.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And I hope that everyone listening today enjoys this as much as I did.
Thank you, Mira. It's great to see you. Thank you.
If you haven't liked or subscribed yet, I invite you to do so. Please come along on this journey with me as we explore life, death, and consciousness together. Thank you so much for being here with me today.